At about 9 o'clock in the morning of December 6, 1917, two railwaymen were sitting inside of a small wooden station in the north end of Halifax, Nova Scotia. Their names were William Lovett and Vincent Coleman. And suddenly a sailor ran through the door with some fairly alarming news. There's a ship burning in the harbor. Now, that in of itself is, not necessarily catastrophic. Halifax at this time is one of the busiest wartime ports in North America. And so there are ships literally everywhere. Accidents happen, fires happen. This is relatively a common thing. But this particular ship is carrying ammunition. An enormous amount of ammunition. And then the sailor tells them, in essence, you need to leave. The ship is going to explode. And so Lovett and Coleman run, which is, of course, the entirely reasonable response when you get that sort of news. They get outside and they can see this great column of black smoke rising beyond the freight cars between the station and the water. And somewhere behind those cars, a French freighter is burning beside Pier 6. And then as they're running, Vincent Coleman remembers something. There is a train coming. Passenger train number 10 is approaching Halifax from St. John, New Brunswick. And there are hundreds of people on board this train, and within minutes it's going to pass through the Richmond Railway Yard directly beside the burning ship. So Coleman stops. And really, this is the moment upon which his entire life will be remembered, because he turns around and runs back into the station. And he sits down at his telegraph key and he begins sending a message along the railway line. Hold the train. Ammunition ship afire in harbor making for Pier 6 and will explode. And then he adds these words. Guess this will be my last message. Goodbye, boys. Now, there are questions about precisely what effect that message had upon train number 10. And we'll come to that here in just a moment, because history is slightly more complicated than the legend of the story. But Coleman, he doesn't know any of that. All he knows is that there is a ship that is burning, and this train is coming, and he only has a few seconds left. Now, outside of this, children are walking to school, and men are arriving to the factories and the railway yards, and families are gathering at their windows because, really, look outside. There's this spectacular fire in the harbor. And frankly, if you had been living in Halifax that morning, you probably would have gone to the window too, because nobody knew what was inside of that ship. Nobody realized that standing beside a window was one of the most dangerous things you could do that particular morning. And nobody knows that at 9:04 and 35 seconds, much of the north end of Halifax is going to disappear. This is the story of the Halifax Explosion, and it begins as so many catastrophes do, with two people looking at one another and effectively saying, "No, you move." You're listening to Stirring Stories, a special storytelling series from the Sandy Creek Stirrings podcast with your host, Dr. Joshua Jimenez. Here we uncover remarkable true stories from history, faith, and the lives of ordinary people. Stories that still challenge and encourage the soul today. To discover more episodes or to visit our press, visit sandycreekstirrings.com. And now, back to the story. Well, in future episodes of the Stirring Stories, we're going to jump right into the story as soon as that little intro is done playing. But this is the very first one, and so I need your help this morning. Here's what I want to know. You listen to the entire episode, and I want you to send me an email or reach out to me through Facebook and let me know whether or not you enjoy this kind of episode on the Sandy Creek Stirrings podcast. My email is, again, joshua@sandycreekstirrings.com. Again, that's joshua@sandycreekstirrings.com, or you can reach out to me through our Facebook page, Sandy Creek Stirrings. And seriously, I want to hear from you. I want to know if the listeners themselves enjoy this type of format, something very different on the Sandy Creek Stirrings podcast. So you reach out to me, let me know. All future episodes will not contain this note. It's just going to be just the story with no intrusion of any type of introductory materials other than what you just heard a second ago. So let's get right back into the story. Now, before we bring these two ships together, we need to understand Halifax at this time. So Halifax has always been shaped by its harbor. It's one of those really magnificent type of natural harbors. I don't know if you visited there before, but it's beautiful. It just seems like it's designed for ships to be there in that harbor. It's broad, very deep, it's sheltered, and by 1917, it's become one of the most important ports in the entire Allied war effort. And so, as you know by now, the First World War has been raging for more than 3 years. And Canadian soldiers are passing through this port city of Halifax on their way to Europe and to the front lines. So this port is seeing a lot of the waters being churned by hospital ships that are bringing wounded men home. Merchant vessels are entering the harbor. They're gathering in that Bedford Basin, and then they cross the Atlantic in guarded convoys. There are troop ships. There are naval vessels. There are freighters and tugs and ferries and coal barges. There are ships everywhere. And the city itself is literally crowded with sailors and soldiers. And the railways, they run right along the waterfront. Factories and warehouses are filled on the north end. And then at night, as the sky goes down, as the sun goes down, that is, and the sky turns really dark, great anti-submarine nets are stretched across the harbor entrance because German U-boats are literally hunting down the ships in the Atlantic, trying to track them down and torpedo them. So the war is thousands of miles away across the Atlantic, but Halifax, well, they can hear that war every time they hear a locomotive whistle, and it can see it every time another ship sails east carrying young men toward France, and it can feel it on the crowded docks and the guarded harbors and the constant movement of men and supplies. So Halifax isn't the front line, but Halifax is one of those great doorways leading to the front line. And on the evening of December 5th, this is 1917, two ships are waiting on the opposite sides of those anti-submarine nets at the front of the harbor. The first of these ships is a Norwegian vessel called the Emo. And the Emo is on her way back to New York. She's supposed to collect some relief supplies for civilians in Belgium. And in fact, painted in enormous letters on the side of the ship are these words, Belgian relief. And it's a very noble message. Unfortunately, noble messages painted on the sides of ships don't necessarily make the ship easier to see or to steer. Now, the Emo is traveling without cargo, so she's sitting unnaturally high up in the water. Her hull is really exposed to the wind, her propeller, her rudder. They're not responding as quickly as they should or as quickly as they would if she was sitting lower in the water column. But she is intended to leave the Halifax port on December 5th. But there was a delay getting some coal aboard, and by the time she's ready, the harbor entrance has been closed for the night, so the Emo has to remain inside. Now, outside of the harbor, there's a French freighter called the Mont Blanc. And the Mont Blanc is trying to come into the harbor while the Emo is trying to come out. This is on the night of December 5th. Her captain is a gentleman by the name of Émile Le Medic, and so he's an experienced French seaman. And aboard her as well is a sailor by the name of Francis Mackey. He's a Halifax harbor pilot who knows these waters extremely well and is helping them navigate through this area. So the Mont Blanc doesn't look, it's just... there's nothing unusual about the Mont Blanc. It's just a freighter. She's not a battleship. There are no great naval guns rising on her deck. She looks like an ordinary cargo vessel just engaged in very ordinary wartime business. But here's the problem. She is carrying something very, very different. She is carrying TNT. And she's carrying picric acid. And she's carrying gun cotton. And in fact, stacked on top of her deck are barrels and barrels of benzol, which is a very highly flammable fuel. And so in other words, she's carrying almost everything you would least like to have aboard a ship that is about to be involved in a big collision. So her cargo is destined for the battlefields of Europe, probably already guessed that, but for the moment, all of that explosive material is sitting outside of Halifax Harbor, waiting for those nets to open. And so through the night, those two ships wait. The Emo inside, eager to leave, and the Mont Blanc is outside, eager to enter. Shortly after sunrise on December 6th, those harbor nets finally drop, and the two ships begin moving. And neither crew knows that this morning has just become permanently attached to many, many others. Now, to reach the Bedford Basin, an incoming vessel had to pass through a very constricted section of the harbor known, well, kind of helpfully, it was known as the Narrows. There were rules for navigating it because it was very, as you guessed, narrow, very constricted. And so a vessel was expected to remain on the right-hand side of the channel. So when two ships are passing or approaching each other, they should both pass on port side to port side, which is the left side of the ship to the left side of the other side of the ship. And so it's much the same basic idea as driving on your side of the road, right? In America, we drive on the right side of the road. You're supposed to drive on your right? So as we're passing each other, both left sides of the cars are passing each other. And so the incoming Mont Blanc, as it's coming into the Halifax Harbor, is roughly where she's supposed to be. But the outgoing Emo is not. The Emo has moved toward the Halifax side of the channel while maneuvering around other vessels. Now, that's not, an immediate concern. That doesn't immediately mean there's a collision because harbors are very busy places. And so ships have to adjust their courses and pilots communicate by whistles. Everybody behaves very sensibly and the problem is solved rather quickly. At least that's what's supposed to happen. Now, Francis Mackey, who's used to that harbor, he's used to Halifax, he's a pilot there. He's aboard the Mont Blanc and he sees that Emo coming toward him. And so he sounds one short blast on the whistle. And that essentially meant that, I'm holding my course, I'm moving to my right, you need to do the same. And the Emo, well, she answers with two blasts. And that two blast sequence means this: no, I intend to move to my left. Now, just to be clear, that's the very opposite of what she should do. It's also the very opposite of what Mackey aboard the Mont Blanc wants the Emo to do. So Mackey sounds that one blast again, hey, no, move over. And the Emo answers with two. Now, imagine for a second being on board one of these vessels. There's time. We're going to be okay. You can imagine that feeling. Mackey is looking at the Emo. He's thinking, what exactly are you doing? And the men aboard the Emo are apparently looking at the Mont Blanc thinking much of the same thing. And the ships continue toward one another. And finally, not just the captains or the pilots aboard the boats, but the sailors themselves on these ships are beginning to take notice because they can hear those whistles and they soon stop and they're watching, what's happening because this has now become a very slow game of chicken played with several thousand tons of steel. So both ships reduce their power, but a ship isn't like a car. You can't simply press a brake. The weight of that ship, especially these large boats, they're going to continue carrying it forward through the water. And then Mackey has another problem because he cannot risk driving the Mont Blanc hard aground in order to avoid this collision because you got to remember what's under his feet. He knows. And so at the last moment, the Mont Blanc turns sharply across the path of the Emo, and for a few seconds it appears that, the vessels might actually miss each other, everything is going to be fine, and then for whatever reason, the Emo reverses her engines. Because the ship is sitting so high up in the water, the action of her propeller pulls her bow sideways, and at approximately 8:45 in the morning, the bow of the Emo strikes the starboard side of the Mont Blanc. And here is one of the most frightening details in the entire story. The collision was not dramatic. There was nothing to assume like there was something wrong. They just tapped each other. They're moving slowly. There's not an enormous crash. No one is thrown from the deck. The people watching from the shore, they just, they hear this little ding and it just seems like, nothing happened. Can you imagine standing there as a person? You're like, there's going to be a big, collision. These whistles are blowing and nothing happens. You might be slightly disappointed. There's just a bit of twisted steel, some damaged plating, Everything is going to be fine. It's just a minor harbor incident. Except the bow of the Emo has torn into the forward section of the Mont Blanc. And in fact, the impact knocks the barrels of benzol from their positions and they split open. And fuel begins to pour across the deck and down into the damaged hold below. And then the Emo begins to pull backwards. And steel scrapes against steel, and sparks fall into the benzol vapor. And suddenly, in just a second of time, a fire races across the deck of the Mont Blanc. Now, Captain Lemedic and his men of the Mont Blanc, they understand immediately what everyone who is watching on shore does not understand. They cannot fight this fire. Because you could ask, why didn't they remain aboard? Why didn't they try to extinguish the fire? The answer was there was no realistic fire left for them to fight. Because once the benzol was burning above the cargo, that ship had become something from which every man needed to get away from as fast as possible. So there was no heroic last stand even available to them aboard the Mont Blanc. Because when the flames reached, not if, but when the flames reached the explosives, every man remaining on the ship would cease to exist. So Lemedic gives the order to abandon ship. And so the French crew, they lower the lifeboats, they begin rowing desperately across the Dartmouth shore. And as they go, they're shouting warnings. They're shouting to the people watching who are watching, the whistles blowing back and forth. They're rowing and they're shouting, get away, get away. They know that the ship is in terrible danger, but they're yelling everything out in French. And most of the people listening on shore have no clue what they're saying because they don't speak French. And so now the Mont Blanc is now drifting across the water, across the harbor with no crew. And she's moving across the harbor until she comes against pier number 6 on the Halifax side. And there she burns. And the fire grows and barrels burst and that thick black smoke begins to climb into the bright winter sky and small explosions begin cracking through the flames. And people come to watch because, of course, they do. People still do this to this day. You got a car on fire beside the road. People naturally slow down their car. They want to see what's going on. There's a wreck. There's whatever. People just stop to look. And people are doing the same thing on the shores there that day in Halifax. In fact, workers are starting to leave their tasks, and children are stopping on their way to school, and families are looking out the windows from their homes. In fact, some people even move closer to the waterfront so they can get a better view. Now, it's very easy for you and I listening today, to look back and say, what are you doing? Why would anybody stand there? Because we know what happens at 9:04, and they do not. They just see a ship that is on fire. They see smoke, they hear ammunition beginning to pop in the heat, but most of them had no idea that that vessel contained millions of pounds of explosive material. And to them, that danger just appeared contained. It was on the ship, they were on land. And as for those watching inside their homes, there was a pane of glass between themselves and the harbor. It felt very, very safe. And so thereafter, the Halifax Fire Department receives an alarm, and firefighters race toward Pier 6 with their new motorized engine, which is known as the Patricia. And tugboats begin moving toward the Mont Blanc. The tug, its name is Stella Maris, attempts to attach a line so that burning vessel can be pulled away from the pier. And these men are moving toward the danger. They have no idea what is aboard the ship, because had they known it, they would have never gone near that boat. And somewhere along the waterfront, that truth finally begins to spread that this isn't just a freighter, this is an ammunition ship, and it is burning. And so when they get ashore, one of the naval officers sends a sailor to warn those near the railway yards, which were right up against the waterfront. And so that sailor runs along. He finally reaches the Little Richmond railway station. He runs through the door, and there are sitting William Lovett and Vincent Coleman, and, tells them what's going on. They run. So you got to understand the man here who's at the key of the telegraph, and this is a man by the name, again, of Vincent Coleman. He's 45 years old. He has a wife. He has children. He's worked for the railway for years. There is nothing in the story of his life before December 6th to suggest that anyone will still be talking about him more than a century later. He's just a normal, ordinary, average guy. Because this guy, there's nothing special about him necessarily. And I think that kind of matters in the story because Coleman didn't wake up that morning and decide, this will be my heroic day. No, he just goes to work and he sits at his station and he carries out the very ordinary responsibilities of a very ordinary life as a railway dispatcher. And then that sailor runs in and tells him, this ship is going to explode, so he runs. And again, a very sensible decision. We should not blame him for running. I mean, that's, if something's on fire and it's going to blow up, that's what you should do. You should run. But then as he's running again, as we talked about in the opening, he remembers train number 10. It's arriving from St. John. And there are hundreds of people aboard that train. And it's moving toward those exact Richmond yards, and it has no idea that there is a burning ammunition ship that is resting beside that very line where that train is going to pull right by. And so Coleman does almost the unthinkable. He turns around and runs back inside. He reaches the telegraph key. And again, the famous version of the story makes it sound as though Coleman's message, stop the train, at the final possible instant. The reality is it's not quite so tidy. Train number 10 was running late, which meant it was still far enough from the center of the explosion to escape most of the destruction. So there's uncertainty of whether Coleman's exact message was responsible for stopping the train or whether it had already passed the last point at which it could have been held anyway. But that doesn't lessen at all what Coleman did. He did not know that the train was running late. He didn't know that they were going to escape the worst of the blast anyway. He didn't know any of that. All he knew is that he needed to get a warning in time to that train so people wouldn't die. And so he had his telegraph key, and he sends that warning, hold up the train. And then he warned that ammunition ship was going to explode. And finally, that message, that tear-jerking message at the end, guess this will be my last message. Goodbye, boys. And it may not have been the final telegraph message he sent, because some accounts suggest that he continued warning the railway even after those words. But it was his final warning, and that warning did travel. And because of his message, railway stations outside of Halifax learned that something catastrophic was happening. So other trains could be stopped, and railway traffic could be held back. The railway system could begin organizing assistance over the explosion, once that explosion came. And Coleman, he could see none of that from the station. All he could see was the smoke. And at 9:04 and 35 seconds, the fire reached the cargo aboard the Mont Blanc. The Mont Blanc disappeared. It didn't break apart into little pieces and kind of float all over the water. It didn't sink. One moment there's a burning ship beside Pier 6, and the very next moment there's just an expanding wall of flame and pressure and smoke and water and white hot metal. And that explosion released a force equivalent to several thousand tons of TNT. For the people nearest the harbor, there was no time to understand what was happening. Pier 6 absolutely vanished. And at this point in time, it was the largest man-made explosion up to this point in history. The waterfront was torn apart, railway cars were lifted and thrown from their tracks, factory walls collapsed, trees snapped, homes folded just in on the families who were inside, telegraph poles fell, chimneys crashed through roofs, fragments of the Mont Blanc just hurled across the city and the harbor. Part of the ship's anchor landed literally miles away. I mean, just think about that for a moment. A piece of an anchor weighing hundreds of pounds has been thrown across the landscape. So that gives you some idea of what these homes are experiencing that are up against the harbor. And the force, the pressure of the explosion forced that harbor water outward and then pulled it violently back, which produced this wave that just swept across the low-lying areas and snatched up everything around it. And don't forget, there's another ship in this story. There's the Emo, and by this time, of course, the Mont Blanc had been abandoned and had been left adrift, and the Emo is on the opposite side now. It's lifted up in the water, and it's driven onto that Dartmouth shore. Now, the Mi'kmaq community at Turtle Grove, near Halifax there, was absolutely devastated. And in Richmond, the North End neighborhood nearest the harbor, streets that existed just seconds earlier were gone. There were no windows, no houses, nothing. Thousands of people had moved toward them to watch the fire. And when that pressure wave reached the homes of Halifax, that glass came inward. And it struck faces and eyes, and it tore through rooms, and hundreds of people suffered serious eye injuries. Many people lost their sight. The very thing that seemed to separate them safely from danger became one of the principal instruments of injury. And nearly 2,000 people died from the explosion and its effects. Thousands more were injured. Many of the dead were children. And in just a fraction of a second, a city that had spent 3 years sending men to battlefields of Europe looked as though it had become a battlefield itself in Halifax. Vincent Coleman's railway station stood only a short distance from the harbor. It was obliterated, and Coleman appears to have died instantly near the telegraph key upon which he had sent his warning. Now, as soon as the explosion happens, and that's a minute or two after, then comes the confusion of everything. Because people wake beneath the wreckage, they don't know where they are, they don't know what has happened. Parents are calling for children. Children are wandering through the streets. They no longer even know where they're at. They don't recognize anything. Men who had been standing beside one another just moments earlier are separated by collapsed walls and burning buildings. I mean, this is the terrible difficulty now facing Halifax, that almost everything the city needs in order to respond has itself been struck down. So if they're going to, telephone somebody, well, those lines are down. Telegraph wires have been cut. Railway tracks are damaged. Roads are blocked. Hospitals, fire station, the different wharves and warehouses, they've all been hit. So the very machinery of that rescue operation has all been caught up in this disaster. But it's incredible. Almost immediately, people begin helping one another. So neighbors are digging through, the ruins with their bare hands, and soldiers and sailors are coming ashore from vessels further out in the harbor. Wagons and automobiles and carts, anything capable of carrying an injured person, they're turned into ambulances. Doors are pulled from ruined buildings and used as stretchers. Doctors begin treating new patients wherever space can be found. And now we enter the story of another man, a man by the name of Dr. Clement Lagour. And he was born in Trinidad. And so he was trained as a physician at Queen's University, became one of the first black doctors who was licensed to practice in Nova Scotia as a physician. But because of the racial prejudice at that time, he had been denied opportunities within Halifax's established medical institutions to be able to practice. He had opened a small private hospital inside of his home there on the outside of Halifax. Now, on December 6th, his home had become one of the city's emergency treatment centers. So the wounded are coming to him, and they kept coming and kept coming and kept coming, and Dr. Lagour treated them through the day and into the night. And so over the days and weeks that followed, he cared for literally hundreds of patients, many of whom could not pay him. And the city had placed limits upon where he was even permitted to serve. But then, of course, the city is shattered, and suddenly they discover they need this doctor, and now they're suddenly willing to overlook his race. But I'll be honest with you, the explosion did not make Clement Lagour compassionate. You say, well, that's kind of mean. Are you saying he was mean? No, I'm saying it revealed what was already there. Because he had already been a compassionate doctor. He'd already been serving where he could, but now all that patience and time and waiting and probably prayers was coming to fruition. And it revealed who he was already up to that point. Now, across Halifax, this same thing is happening. Some people have lost their homes, but they're helping their neighbors search for their children. Some are injured, yet they're caring for others. Some have no idea where their own relatives are alive or not, and they're treating strangers in their wounds. And then, because apparently the destruction is not enough, the weather turns, and snow begins falling. And by night, A winter storm is moving across the ruins. Wind drives snow through the homes without roofs, and fires are continuing to burn, and the streets are filled with broken glass and timber and fallen wires. Families who have lost everything are now facing a freezing night, many of them without shelter. But outside Halifax, the warning, even the one sent out by Coleman, has traveled along. Relief trains begin moving toward the city. That's remarkable in and of itself because the explosion has damaged much of the railway. Yet before the day is over, the trains are already finding their way toward Halifax by different lines, carrying the help they need. Doctors are coming and nurses are coming and medical supplies, blankets and foods and clothes and lumber and tools. All of these are coming down the railway lines. And help even arrives from across Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. People are just sending help to them. One of the biggest helps actually came from our own nation, the United States, particularly from Massachusetts and specifically Boston. Boston sends doctors and nurses and money and supplies northward through that winter storm to help the people of Halifax. Now, can the people on board these ships, can they undo what happened at 9:04? Well, no, they can't. They can't restore the dead. For many people, they can't return, those eyes that are now blinded. And they can't rebuild the city overnight, but they can come. And so they do come to help in whatever way they can. And in the days after the explosion, people naturally want to know who is to blame for all of this. Who is to blame for all these injuries and all this death and this big accident? Because the Mont Blanc was carrying explosives. And on the opposite side, the Emo was navigating on the wrong side of the channel. The French crew, they had abandoned the ship. The whistles had been exchanged. The collision had happened. Who was to blame? Who could they place the blame on for this catastrophe? And so Captain Lemedic and the pilot, Francis Mackey, both aboard the Mont Blanc, the French naval officer, they were arrested. Mackey, in particular, was treated very, very harshly. But over time, the very simple story of blame began to collapse. The Emo had been navigating improperly. Harbor procedures were confused. Wartime traffic had placed extraordinary pressure upon the port. Communication had failed. Several smaller decisions really had combined to this big catastrophe. And really beneath everything was the terrible fact that a ship carrying one of the largest explosive cargoes ever brought through that harbor had been required to pass through a very busy city, and nobody had been warned about it. So I don't think when you look back in history that you can really point out a single villain in this story, upon the deck, choosing out of his desire to destroy Halifax. That's really not the case. There were many stubborn decisions. There were misunderstood signals and procedural failures, men assuming that the other ship would move. All of these played a part in this catastrophe. And so a very ordinary collision, which because of what lay hidden inside of one vessel, became an almost unimaginable problem, a catastrophe, like really had not been known as far as explosively up to that point in time. And that may be one of the reasons why this story is so unsettling, because that morning did not begin with an obvious evil. It began with impatience, miscommunication, delay, perhaps pride. Ordinary decisions made by ordinary people who do not understand that how much was resting upon them that very morning. Now, Halifax rebuilt very slowly, but homes began to rise where those ruins once stood, and railway tracks were repaired, and factories were reopened, and families began learning how to live in that city that had been forever divided by that time before and now after 9:04 in the morning. The survivors remember the firefighters, the tugboat crews. They had moved toward that burning vessel. They didn't even know what happened inside, but they'd given their lives to try and fix and resolve the situation. They remember the doctors. They remember the nurses. They remember Dr. Clement Legour still being compassionate when he could have said, you know what, you didn't accept me before. I'm not going to give you any care now. He didn't do that, and they remembered his kindness during that time. They remembered the men and the women who came through the snow carrying blankets and medical supplies. They remembered Vincent Coleman returning to his station. And Halifax, to this day, remembers the help that came from Boston, Massachusetts. Because each year, Nova Scotia sends a Christmas tree to Boston. It's placed upon the Boston Commons, and it's covered with Christmas lights. Many people who walk beneath it probably do not know the entire story. To them, it's simply this beautiful Christmas tree at Christmas time, but that tree is a visible thank you because it is a memory that is carried in those branches and in those lights. It's that explosion that lasted less than a second, but it's a reminder of that kindness that followed it is still being remembered more than a century later. Now, there are many ways to tell the story of the Halifax Explosion. You can tell it as a story of navigation, a story of wartime secrecy, institutional failure, rescue, a city destroyed and rebuilt. You could tell it in a lot of different ways. But one for me, when I think about the story of the Halifax Explosion, the detail that I really can't get away from is Coleman sitting down at that telegraph key. Because Coleman, he can't stop what's happening. There's no telegraph, key button he could push and boom, everything would be okay and there'd be no fire and everything would be all right. He can't extinguish the fire. He can't shove the Mont Blanc off of Pier 6. He can't even evacuate the north end of Halifax. But I'll tell you what he can do. He could stand in front of the approaching train and try to stop it from there being even more wreckage and carnage. Now, you think about Vincent Coleman. He's just an ordinary telegraph runner, just an ordinary railway guy. He had no great authority, and he had no great command. He had no power over the harbor. All Vincent Coleman had on that morning was just a few seconds and a telegraph key. That's all he had. But he did what was it within his reach. The Bible says in Philippians chapter 2, verse 4, "Look not every man on his own things, but every man also on the things of others." Coleman had every reason to look upon his own things, right? He had every reason. He had a wife, he had kids, he had a home, he had, a future life. He's not an old man, he's a younger man. He's got everything, every reason is right there in front of him to think about his own things. And really, I don't know that too many people, especially reasonable people, could have condemned him for continuing to run away. Especially when at the end of the story, we know the train was really not in any danger of being harmed. But he didn't know that. All he could remember for himself was the people on the train. People he did not know, people who did not know him, people who would probably never understand what he did for them, but he still turned back. You go over and you think about Dr. Clement Legore. He couldn't rebuild Halifax, but he could open his home. You think about the people of Boston, Massachusetts. They could not reverse the explosion, but they could board a relief train. They could bring help. A neighbor couldn't clear every ruined street, but he could lift one timber and he could help one person out. He could carry one child. He could dress one wound. He could offer one blanket. And perhaps really that's where the story reaches you and I, because we can become so overwhelmed by everything we cannot repair that we often neglect the one act of faithfulness that is still within our reach. And sometimes we don't do that because we think, well, I can't solve every problem and I can't carry every burden and I can't prevent every tragedy. But there is often something good still left for you and I to do. One warning to give, one door to open, one person to remember, one journey to make through the snow. Look, Coleman's message didn't save Halifax. Faithfulness doesn't always prevent the disaster. But sometimes faithfulness is just doing the right thing with that moment that remains. At 8:45 that morning, two ships touched in the Narrows. It seemed like a minor collision. At 9:04, the Mont Blanc disappeared. The windows came inward. The waterfront vanished. The railway station was destroyed. And somewhere along the line, a telegraph began printing the words of a man who had chosen to return to his post. The ship is gone. The station is gone. Vincent Coleman is gone. But every Christmas, lights shine upon a Christmas tree in Boston, and those lights testify to the terrible moments that reveal more than the danger hidden inside of a ship. They reveal what has been hidden inside of people. Pride, fear, compassion, courage, and for some people in the story, the quiet faithfulness of an ordinary man who remembered that something else was coming down the line.